In recent years, a series of extraordinary finds has been made in the Holy Land. These astonishing discoveries are linked to some of the most famous events in the Bible. They appear to be new evidence for the burial of Jesus and for the legendary Temple of Solomon.
This is something that biblical scholars have been waiting for, have been dreaming of for many years.
Here is a proof. We can touch it, we can smell it, we can go see it. This is where we came from.
It's an earthquake, a revolution.
Or is there another darker story behind these mysterious objects? Jerusalem, the Holy Land's most important city. For centuries, it's been the center of a flourishing antiquity trade. Government inspectors try to monitor the trade, but thousands of artifacts change hands here every day. Genuine pieces 2,000 or more years old can be bought for a few $100s. And many collectors have learned not to ask awkward questions about how the dealer came by them. And it was here more than 25 years ago, in Jerusalem's antiquity market, that one of the most remarkable artifacts in the Holy Land's history first came to light. It was a tiny object, just 4 centimeters long, badly damaged, and no one knew where it came from, but it would be hailed as a unique piece of history. It became known as the ivory pomegranate. It was thought to be the ornamental tip of a priest's ceremonial staff. But what amazed the experts was the inscription.
Kodesh Kohanim lebeit Adonai.
Holy to the priests of the house of God. It suggested that this exquisite little ornament was used by priests in the first temple of Jerusalem, which, according to the Bible, was built by King Solomon. If the pomegranate was what its inscription claimed, it was a revolutionary find. Before it came to light, there was no independent evidence, apart from the Bible, that Solomon's temple had actually existed. 3,000 years ago, Jerusalem was a small Iron Age city whose ambitious king, the Bible tells us, decided to build a house for his God.
In the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, the construction of the Temple of the Lord was begun.
The existence of Solomon's temple is central to traditional Jewish belief.
The house which King Solomon built for the Lord, the length thereof was 80 cubits, the breadth thereof 20 cubits, and the height thereof 30 cubits.
Over 12 meters high and over 30 meters long, the house of God would have dominated the city and its people. Since then, Jerusalem has suffered nearly 2,500 years of turbulent history. Jews, Christians and Muslims all claim a stake in the city that features so large in the history of their faiths. A vast Muslim shrine, the Dome of the Rock, now occupies the site where Solomon's temple is presumed to have stood. According to biblical history, the temple was destroyed by fire in 586 BC by invaders from Babylon. The Western Wall, where Jewish pilgrims now come to pray, is all that's left of a second temple, built on the same site as Solomon's temple by King Herod the Great 500 years later. In a country where cultural and territorial rights are the essence of politics, the story of Solomon's temple has special significance for the Jews. But there's no trace of the temple itself, and archaeologists are not allowed to dig in such a politically sensitive area. Archaeologist Israel Finkelstein has amassed thousands of artifacts from that period of history, but not a fragment of evidence to back up the Bible's account of Solomon's temple.
There's no archaeological evidence for the simple reason that we cannot excavate in the Temple Mount. I think also that even if it was possible to do something on the Temple Mount, there's a big question whether we could have discovered anything from the first temple of biblical times, because there was a huge building operation there in the time of Herod the Great, and there's good reason to think that everything was eradicated.
So the pomegranate was an extraordinary find. The tiny artifact with a large chip on one side was the first physical link to the lost Temple of Solomon. But was the pomegranate authentic? The man who came across it in the Jerusalem market happened to be one of the world's leading experts on ancient inscriptions, Professor André Lemaire.
One of the sellers told me, I know an inscription which belongs to somebody else, and will you be interested to see it?
He examined it closely.
It's a very small object. You have to be aware that it is only about 4 centimeters high. And the inscription is still smaller, of course. And looking at it very carefully, I found that from what I could say, everything was okay. There was no problem.
After inspecting the engraved Aramaic text, Lemaire had no doubt it was genuine. He published his report, declaring it to be authentic from the 8th century BC, the time of Solomon's temple. The tiny pomegranate would have played a humble part in the magnificent temple. It would have been carried on processions through the 2 great halls whose walls were panelled in sweet-smelling cedar wood. If the pomegranate belonged to one of the high priests, it would have accompanied him into the temple's inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, where winged cherubim guarded the Ark of the Covenant, and the towering walls were encrusted with gold. But however humble its role might have been then, it was now the only artifact to survive from the temple. The Israel Museum, home to a world-renowned collection of biblical artifacts, was now very keen to acquire it.
It was an object of some excitement because when first identified, it was considered that it might be an object directly connected to the first temple, to Solomon's temple. And we really have very little material that comes from that period from Jerusalem, and that can be directly connected to that moment in history and to the physical existence of the temple.
But when the museum tried to track down the owner, it ran into a wall. The pomegranate had already changed hands. There wasn't a dealer in Israel who seemed to know where it was. The word was it had been smuggled out of the country. Then, several years later, in 1987, out of the blue, the museum received a mysterious phone call.
כן. אני יכול להציע לך למכירה את רימון השנהב.
מי הבעלים?
The pomegranate was now available, but at a price.
Who wrote $1 million?
Desperate to get their hands on this unique piece of Jewish heritage, the museum bartered the price down to just over $500,000 in cash. Israel's leading expert was asked to check it out. When he too decided it was genuine, the cash, provided by an anonymous donor, was paid into an anonymous Swiss bank account. The pomegranate was returned to Jerusalem, and there, in the Israel Museum, along with such priceless national treasures as the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was given pride of place, an authentic link to King Solomon's temple. For nearly 20 years, it was regarded as the only physical evidence for the temple. Then, In uncannily similar circumstances, another extraordinary artifact became headline news. In 2002, the chief investigator for the Israel Antiquities Authority, Amir Ganor, was given a special mission to track down a brand new piece of biblical history that had gone missing. It was a hunt that would take him the length and breadth of the country and provide a major scoop for a young Israeli newspaper reporter.
The story begins in 2001. A professor from the Jerusalem University receives a call from a mysterious person who refuses to give his real name and asks this professor to come to a hotel in Jerusalem. He arrives at another professor. He receives another call saying, we are changing the location of the meeting. Please take a taxi to a different hotel. A person who he has never met before arrives with a briefcase.
The man with the briefcase claimed to be acting on behalf of a client. He couldn't reveal his client's identity, but was sure the professors would be very interested by what he had brought to show them.
He opens up the briefcase, takes out a gorgeous piece of black stone with an ancient writing on it, and asks the two professors to authenticate the piece.
The inscription on the shiny black stone described repairs made to the Temple of Solomon by a king called Jehoash in the 8th century BC. If it was genuine, it was priceless. Like the ivory pomegranate, it appeared to confirm that Solomon's temple had actually existed. Better still, it provided unique confirmation of events described in the Old Testament. The professors wanted to know who the owner was and where the object had come from. All the stranger would reveal was that it had been found near the Temple Mount.
They wanted to take the stone, they wanted to perform a thorough investigation of it and to authenticate it or reveal it as a forgery. The person refused, of course, to give the stone. He said that's impossible because of complications.
There was no way the professors could properly authenticate the tablet after such a brief examination.
He takes the stone, he puts it back in his briefcase. He says, thank you very much to the two bewildered professors, and leaves them behind in the Jerusalem lobby.
The place where the tablet had allegedly been found was at the foot of the Temple Mount, the heart of Old Jerusalem, where, according to legend, Solomon's temple once stood. But how could anyone be sure that a blackened stone, allegedly found in a pile of rubble, was a genuine 3,000-year-old relic? The owner, whoever he was, realized this. For shortly afterwards, other experts were secretly approached by intermediaries and asked if they could authenticate the tablet. One of them, geologist Amnon Rosenfeld, has spent his working life studying the rocks around Jerusalem used by masons and engravers in biblical times.
We were asked to examine something that should be kept secret, called the Joash tablet. Our starting point was that this is a fake and we should find some signature of a forgery.
Dr. Rosenfeld and his colleagues were allowed to examine the stone over several months in his lab at the Geological Survey of Israel.
We couldn't find anything that led us to the conclusion that it's a forgery. We find many criteria that point out that it might be an authentic inscription.
If the tablet was genuine, it was precisely what Jewish archaeologists have been seeking for ages.
I was very excited because this type of inscription is something that biblical scholars have been waiting for, have been hoping for, have been dreaming of for many years.
The inscription on the tablet corroborated the Bible's account of how King Jehoash decided to refurbish the temple. The Book of Kings tells us that repairs were needed to the building, which would by then have been over 100 years old.
From his benefactor, they in turn shall strengthen the damage in the house, wherever damage may be found.
And this is how the tablet records those events.
I repaired the construction, and I made the repairs in the temple and the walls all around, and the side buildings and the lattice work, and the trapdoors and the recesses and the doors. And I think that we're speaking about the same royal act of repairs in the temple. And the language is also rather similar.
Meanwhile, analysis of the tablet by the scientists had revealed more. They found the surface contained tiny flecks of charcoal, which proved to be over 2,000 years old. And they found tiny specks of gold, just what might be expected if it had survived a fire when the gold-encrusted Temple of Solomon was destroyed. The astonishing revelation was widely regarded as proof that the tablet was genuine.
Everyone was dumbfounded by this discovery. I mean, it was like an alien spacecraft landing in the middle of Jerusalem. Here's a stone with an inscription that is actually quoted from the Jewish Bible, and that proves that a Jewish temple actually stood in Jerusalem. Here is a proof that our national heritage can be basically, we can touch it, we can smell it, we can go see it, we can take our children. This is where we came from.
The Israel Antiquities Authority urgently wanted to know how the owner, whoever he was, had come by an artifact of such national and historical significance. Amir Ganor, the authority's chief investigator, pumped his contacts in the market for information. He suspected it had been illegally looted. But the word on the street told a different story, as journalist Boaz Gaon soon discovered.
I traveled to Jerusalem and started to dig and try and find out who the owner of this new tablet is. And the people in the antique industry who do not like to expose their identity, they told me straight away that they think it's a hoax.
Whether it was a hoax, or loot, or the genuine article, Amir Ganor was determined to track down the owner and the tablet itself, which had now disappeared again. He had many rumors to follow, but it would take a long time to get a clear picture.
We spent 3 months on the road to try to find this tablet.
The months of detective work finally led him to Tel Aviv, Israel's modern commercial capital. And in a fashionable residential quarter, to the home of a businessman. One of Israel's leading antiquity collectors, Oded Golan. Golan has been collecting ancient artifacts since he was a boy.
Here you are looking now at the oldest, the most ancient dictionary ever found in the world. I found it when I was 10 years old.
He admitted he had been helping to sell the missing stone tablet, but denied he had ever been its owner.
He was a dealer, Palestinian dealer, who had a shop in East Jerusalem. Abu Yasser was his nickname. I didn't have enough money to buy it. And he asked me if I can help him to sell it or to offer it to somebody. And I had actually only one condition. It should stay in a museum for the public.
But how much was he asking for it?
Several hundred thousands of dollars.
But the authorities were not convinced by the story. And what made them highly suspicious was that the same collector, Oded Golan, had recently been involved in another sensational discovery that had suddenly appeared. In the vast collection of ancient treasures held by the Israel Antiquities Authority, there are hundreds of stone boxes, all dating back to the time of Jesus. Simply engraved, some bearing a name in Hebrew or Greek, they had a macabre purpose. They are ossuaries, receptacles for storing the bones of the dead. In 2002, one of these ancient bone boxes became the center of worldwide media attention. Yaakov bar Yosef, Akidei Yeshua. The inscription translates as James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. For these familiar names from the New Testament to appear together seemed a remarkable coincidence. The ancient bone box was hailed as the final resting place of St. James, the brother of Jesus of Nazareth, and the first archaeological evidence linked to Jesus himself. It caused a sensation and was viewed by nearly 100,000 people at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. Another extraordinary biblical artifact. And its owner was Oded Golan.
Two dramatic artifacts were discovered in the space of 6 months by the same collector. This was very, very difficult to believe. I mean, you know, what's next? The shoes of Muhammad?
I have to admit that it sounds quite strange. But if you have the good contacts, the good relationship, you get the good stuff. It's very simple.
He claimed he had owned the ossuary for years.
In the mid-70s, I bought several ossuaries, actually 3, and I bought it in East Jerusalem.
So why had it taken him 30 years to realize the possible significance of the inscription?
The first person who actually gave me the idea that it could belong to the family of Jesus Christ was Professor André Lemaire.
Back in the 1980s, Professor Lemaire had been responsible for authenticating the ivory pomegranate. 20 years later, his reputation as an expert in ancient inscriptions proved valuable to Oded Golan. But not every expert was convinced the inscription was authentic.
I laughed. I couldn't believe it. You gotta be kidding, it's not the same script. It's not even a complete script design.
To Dr. Rochelle Altman, it seemed that the inscription had been cobbled together from bits of genuine inscriptions. She thought the first part of the inscription, James, son of Joseph, was probably authentic, but that the brother of Jesus had been added later by another hand.
The Yaakov bar Yosef is original. This is the ossuary of this man. And all of a sudden, here's this, and this is totally different script. It's made out of different pieces and pasted together. And that's exactly what we have here. This is obviously a fake.
With allegations of fakery flying around, the authorities decided to crack down. Police and Antiquities Authority agents raided Oded Golan's home. They found an incriminating photograph of the collector clutching the missing Jehoash tablet, which he had always denied owning. They made him hand it over, then confiscated the ossuary too. The artifacts and their collector were about to be subjected to intensive scrutiny. The Israel Antiquities Authority set up a task force to decide on the authenticity of both objects. In charge of the scientific investigation was Professor Yuval Gorin of Tel Aviv University. He began with the stone tablet. He wanted to establish whether it could have come from the site of Solomon's temple on the Temple Mount. The stone's surface should provide valuable clues. Over time, all objects develop a patina, a thin crust bonded to their surface. It's created by chemical reactions between the object and its environment. But when Gorin examined the patina, he found that it was different on the front and the back of the stone. The patina on the front did indeed appear to come from Jerusalem. But instead of being bonded to the stone, it lifted off quite easily.
The patina is very loosely connected to the stone. Here you can see how it reacts to me scraping it with a matchstick, and you can see that it easily peels off the letters as opposed again to the patina on the back side.
The patina on the back was different and appeared not to come from Jerusalem at all. He concluded that someone had taken an old stone from somewhere else and carved an inscription on the front, which had then been concealed under a new artificial patina. He could even see evidence that the carving was recent.
When the letters are cleared, the inner part of the letters is exposed, and as you can see here, it is very freshly cut. You can see even the little lines, the little parallel lines of either the chisel or even maybe some drill, some electric bit or drill with which the letters were engraved, which is of course very unusual for ancient inscriptions.
And what of the ancient charcoal and traces of gold, which had convinced earlier scientists? Goran concluded they had simply been added to the artificial patina applied to the front of the stone.
And therefore I believe that the inscription is not genuine.
Then he turned to the brother of Jesus ossuary. The bone box itself appears to be genuine. The stone was covered by a chalky patina, just what he'd expect if it had spent many years in an underground tomb. But the patina in the grooves of the inscription was different. Like the Joash tablet, it was not firmly bonded to the surface. It looked as if the engraver had cut through the original patina, then filled in the grooves with a new material to make it look ancient. On June the 18th, 2003, the Israel Antiquities Authority goes public. Both objects are declared fake.
Certainly that the patina in the letters in both items is a model forgery.
It hits the headlines worldwide. Experts who authenticated the artifacts have their names dragged through the mud.
It was manipulated. It was really very, very politicized.
For me, it's clear it is not a forgery.
But more damning evidence now comes to light when police and authority inspectors raid Oded Golan's premises again. They find engraving tools, chemicals, and soil samples taken from sites all over Israel, together with scores of artifacts. Many look freshly minted or half-finished.
They confiscated several tools that I had in my home. These kind of tools are existed in the hands of any collector and any dealer in Israel.
But the evidence leads to Golan being charged on 15 counts of forgery and fraud. 4 other dealers are accused of being accomplices.
I never forged anything in my life. Of course, I shall have to defend myself, but they have nothing to do with forgeries at all.
3 years on, the prosecution of Oded Golan on fraud and forgery charges continues. And there's still no end in sight. But whoever was responsible, it seems a sophisticated fraud is beginning to unravel. The scandal has provoked anxiety about every artifact, supposedly from biblical times, that has come from dealers or sources unknown. Could they all be forgeries? Yuval Goren has checked scores of items that museums and collectors have acquired on the market. He has concluded that almost all of them are fake. Some archaeologists believe there's only one answer to the problem. The antiquity trade should be shut down and its products should be shunned.
Objects must come from an archaeological excavation done by archaeologists. then they are genuine, there's no question about them, then they are okay, they can use them for historical research. Even whatever comes from the market is forgery until otherwise proven.
This is a country where the antiquities market has been thriving ever since medieval crusaders came hunting for holy relics. Some shops are as old as the antiquities they sell. But in this city, the buyer should beware and assume that if material isn't looted, it's probably fake. Though not in this shop, of course.
Rabbi, where do you get your antiquities from?
Well, probably you should ask my dad about this.
I inherited them really from my family. We used to get them from the people they dig, but not anymore.
Why not?
Not allowed, against the rules here in Israel. Not allowed to buy from people they dig.
Whether an artifact is genuine, or looted, or fake, there are ways of enhancing its market value.
The collectors always want special things. This is authentic jar. This is from the Iron Age, from the 7th century BC. If it's ordinary jar without any decoration or inscription, it will cost something between $700 to $1,000. But if someone add some inscription here in ancient Hebrew, it will be cost hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Adding an inscription is less work and less expensive than faking a whole artifact. And as investigators have uncovered more fakes, they feel a pattern is emerging of ancient objects being embellished with inscriptions to enhance their value and historical significance. They even have a good idea how forgers are producing inscriptions good enough to fool the experts, using a standard reference book published by the Israel Antiquities Authority. Details of inscriptions from genuine artifacts are copied precisely, then reassembled as the template for a new engraving. This is Yaakov, James in ancient Hebrew. Next, son of Yosef. To create brother of Jesus, letters are taken from several ancient sources to complete the template. James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. And it looks completely authentic. Any artifact of unknown origin with a compelling inscription has now become suspect. So it was inevitable that attention would return to that priceless object in the Israel Museum, the ivory pomegranate. The pomegranate was now the only item believed to have survived from Solomon's legendary temple. Over 25 years had passed since the pomegranate had first been authenticated by one of the world's experts on ancient inscriptions, Professor André Lemaire. Since then, experts had discovered that it wasn't actually made of elephant ivory, but came from a quite different beast.
It is a little pomegranate made of tooth of a hippopotamus.
But the big question was, did the pomegranate really come from Solomon's temple? When Professor Goren examined the surface of the pomegranate, he saw little to suggest that it was not a genuine artifact.
You can see that it is old, it is worn.
There were signs of a few repairs, traces of what looks like glue, but the patina looked ancient. Then he turned his attention to the inscription.
Kodesh Kohanim Lebeit Adonai, which means holy to the priests of the house of God. And this is why this pomegranate was considered to be from the Solomonic temple.
But the pomegranate was badly damaged sometime in its history. He noticed that the grooves cut by the engraver appeared to stop short of the break, which was odd. He would have expected them to be sliced cleanly when the pomegranate was damaged.
The lines are ending before the edge of the break, which means that whoever engraved it was very careful not to make other breaks into the old break.
It looked to Goran as if the inscription had been engraved after the pomegranate had been damaged.
It is clear, when you look at it through the microscope, that the inscription was engraved on it when it was already broken.
So someone must have added the inscription to boost the pomegranate's value.
It is probably a fake. It's probably a forgery.
But Goran's analysis makes no sense to the pomegranate's champion, Professor Lemaire.
He made a mistake because it is not his field.
Although the pomegranate is authentic, it is ancient, the inscription was most likely engraved in modern times.
Yuval Goran is walking out of his field. And in this case, even if it is a professor at the university, if somebody is walking out of this field, out of his specialty, he is not a specialist to be trusted.
But the man who first authenticated the pomegranate now finds himself in a very small minority. The pomegranate has been declared a fake and removed from display in the Israel Museum. Jerusalem can prove a nightmare for archaeologists, with major monuments of three religions crowding on top of each other. And in a quiet residential quarter called Talpiot, apartment blocks overlook one of the most contentious archaeological sites in the world. In a tiny rose garden, a large concrete slab conceals the entrance to a 2,000-year-old tomb. The crudely built structure offers no clue to the potential importance of what lies beneath. Cut into the rocky hillside, the tomb was discovered accidentally in 1980, when the whole area was still a construction site. Before it could disappear under the new buildings, a small team of archaeologists was allowed to examine the tomb and its contents. Among them was Shimon Gibson, then 21 years old. His job was to map the inside of the tomb.
Well, under this cement slab is a shaft which descends for a couple of meters down into the ground. At the bottom of the shaft is an opening which is situated here, which leads into a burial chamber which is still intact. It's really nice. After 27 years, the tomb is still here. The tomb itself was full of soil, at least up to knee level at the time of the excavation, which meant that the door had been opened in antiquity and that soil had flowed in to the cave itself. So this wasn't an intact tomb.
Questions about when it was broken into have recently ignited speculation about what the tomb originally contained. Since they were discovered, the ossuaries from the tomb have been kept at the Antiquities Authority's store. And it was there, 27 years later, in 2007, that the names inscribed on the ossuaries provoked intense media speculation about the occupants of the tomb. Most of the names are well known from the New Testament of the Bible. Mariamme, a form of Mary, Mary Magdalene perhaps. Jose, a short form of Joseph. Maria, another Mary. And then, most astonishing of all, Yeshua bar Yosef, Jesus, son of Joseph. Could this be the resting place of Jesus himself? The suggestion that this might be the tomb of the family of Jesus received worldwide publicity. Now the man involved in the original excavation wants to examine the tomb again.
Anything which is sealed up creates a kind of sort of atmosphere of conspiracy. So I think opening up the slab and allowing cameras to go down and to have a look at the tomb would be a good thing.
Permission has been given to examine the tomb, but it soon becomes clear that some residents don't want an excavation in their backyard.
An area which is, and there's a lot of emotion.
It highlights the problems that can arise for archaeologists in a country where religious passions run high.
He's going to call the police that he doesn't want us excavating and he's quite angry.
Pressing on now could provoke a worse disturbance. So the Telpiot tomb remained sealed. But from the map Gibson drew of the tomb when it was opened, we can still get a good idea of how the remains of the family were laid out. There were bones and skulls lying on the floor. The ossuaries lay in small chambers, cut into the walls of the tomb. The one bearing the name Jesus, son of Joseph, was one of the smallest, tucked in the back of one chamber. Most archaeologists are very skeptical that this could have been Jesus of Nazareth.
One thing I can tell you for certain, and that is that there were no remains of a crucified man in this tomb.
And the coincidence of the names, however striking, fails to impress specialists in this period of history.
These names are extremely common among the local Jewish population in the time of Jesus. It's also problematic because everything that we know about Jesus and his family indicates that they were a relatively poor family who could not have afforded a rock-cut tomb. If they had owned a rock-cut tomb, presumably it would have been in Nazareth, their hometown, not in Jerusalem. We have good evidence for this from other wealthy families around the country.
And while the historical controversy rages, some scientists think it would be a good idea to re-examine the ossuaries that came from the disturbed tomb. American researchers now want to subject them to forensic-style scrutiny, especially the most controversial Jesus, son of Joseph inscription.
Because it looks like these scratches are new.
They wonder whether dirt that's been impacted in the inscription could be concealing signs of recent tampering.
We're actually trying to remove some of the soil that's been impacted in the inscriptions and scratches. Not only that, try to remove the soil safely as not to destroy any patina.
The grooves of the inscription contain traces of mud, which have to be removed if they are to examine the inscription in detail. It seems that Jesus, son of Joseph, may not be the only name engraved on the box.
It appears that the name Yeshua, if this is the actual name, because it's a very difficult name to read, is not the original name on this ossuary. Yeshua appears to be superinscribed over an earlier name that appeared before that. It could be something like Yudan, Hanun, or a number of possibilities, but Yeshua was not the first one in the ossuary.
The name Yeshua bar Yosef, Jesus, son of Joseph, has been inscribed very crudely and incorporates some of the underlying inscription. Could this have an innocent explanation? Or has Jesus been carved later as a deliberate deception by adding a few extra strokes, then using mud to make them look older?
Yeah, it's coming, patina is coming away there.
Maybe you're right about the mud here that was put as a disguise, you know, to cover up things, yeah?
The existence of this hardened mud inside, we have to look for some explanation for it because we don't really have a good explanation yet. But that's what we're in the process of doing, is trying to figure out if this hardened mud was something that somebody pressed into the inscription in order to make it look better or whatever. It's not very clear yet.
So now you're starting to get some of the patina away.
If we're able to remove the mud successfully without damaging the inscription itself, this would hope to at least dispel any ideas that this has any problems in terms of some kind of tampering.
An area that we know has been unaffected by tape and the mud.
But these questions are not likely to be answered just yet. Worried that removing the mud might risk harming the ossuary's delicate patina, the Israel Antiquities Authority has now called a halt to further investigation. But whatever the eventual conclusions about tampering, the scientists' concerns are symptomatic of the widespread anxiety and alarm caused by recent revelations of fakery and fraud.
I do think that the recent sensational claims have made a mockery of the discipline of archaeology. when a real and important archaeological find is made, the public are unable to evaluate whether it's true or false.
In a country where three powerful religions stake their claim to be the heirs of history, where believers will seize on any evidence that backs up their faith, archaeologists have a tough job separating fiction from fact.
This matters a lot to us if we ever want to live in a real world, because what we have is fiction invading the real world.
It stains archaeological research, first of all. It stains reconstruction of biblical history. And there is a complete contamination of our research.
And I think that we need to make a statement against this.
As scores of fake artifacts have been sold around the world, academic reputations have been trashed, and millions of dollars have changed hands. But it's not just museums and wealthy collectors who are being defrauded. Distorting history has profound consequences for everyone.
You know, you feel betrayed. You feel that you were deceived. It's one thing to lie about something that is not important to people, and it's something that's to lie about something that is intrinsic to their identity.
Next tonight in our Treasures Revealed week, Francis Pryor argues that we've got our facts wrong when it comes to what we think we know about Britain after the Romans left. Britain AD on History in just a moment.